Good morning. Welcome to the Rotary Club of Hudson. My name is Marilyn Orr, President of the club, and we are thrilled to have you join us today. This meeting broadcast is available on HCTV, as well as our Rotary of Hudson YouTube channel and Facebook. Our club meets weekly using this digital platform, Zoom. When we meet in person, it's at Laurel Lake Retirement Community for breakfast. We hope to get back to that soon. We meet most Wednesday mornings from 7:15 to 8:30 a.m. So come out to join us for a meeting. We would love to have you as a guest. To learn more about Rotary, our club, and the impact we are having on our local community and the world, please visit our website, rotaryhudson.org. So enjoy this meeting today and help us share the message that Rotary opens doors of opportunity.
The Rotary Club of Hudson, and welcome to those that aren't members that are joining us as well for our meeting this morning. Our invocation today is by Phil Herman. No? Can't hear you.
Sorry, I had to unmute.
It's by Catherine.
It is?
Yes.
Oh, I didn't know that. It says Phil Herman on the list.
I got a call last night by Jim.
Okay, Catherine.
Catherine, take it away.
Fight over it.
Phil wouldn't fight me. Please join me. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for everyone here today. We thank you for always walking with us, even when we are not aware of your presence. Please help us to always look for the good in others. Help us to always show kindness. Open our hearts so that we have understanding what others are going through and experiencing. We pray you will give us courage and peace this week. In your name we pray, amen.
Amen. And now to lead us in the pledge and the four-way test, Jay Yard.
Good morning, everyone. Please join me in the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice
for all.
Now the four-way test of four things we think say.
Sorry, I'm trying to share my screen, but
That's all right, I have it. Not to worry.
okay.
First, is it the truth? Second, is it fair to all concerned? 3, will it build goodwill and better friendships? And 4th, will it be beneficial
to all concerned? Thank you, Jay, and thank you, Catherine. And now our president, Marilyn Orr.
Well, good morning, Rotarians, and welcome to the end of our Education Week. Education Month. This is birthday week, though, for the following Rotarians. On Monday, August 24th, James Young and Mimi Becker were celebrating. Today, it's Bill McClure's birthday, and tomorrow, Catherine Sines will be celebrating. And on Friday, Richard Nebbiolo. So happy birthday to everyone. It's a plethora of birthdays this week. So, as I mentioned before, today is the end of Education Month. Today, we do not have a business spotlight, but we will pick it back up again next week. So, John Adams, can you please introduce our speaker? Can you unmute yourself, John? There we go.
There you go. Thank you. My wife actually prefers the mute on when I talk to her. I don't understand why, but anyhow. So, okay. So it's my privilege to introduce Matt Jordan. I'm going to read his impressive bio to all of you. The title of his presentation, by the way, is Civility, Tribalism, and Higher Education. How's that for an interesting title? So a little bit about Matt is he's both a longtime resident and a recent arrival. So his family moved here from Shaker Heights in '83, where he started first grade, graduated from Hudson High in '95, went on to Ohio State, where he earned a bachelor's degree in philosophy, a master's degree in philosophy at Talbot School of Theology in California, and a PhD in philosophy from Ohio State University, specializing in the philosophy of religion and moral philosophy. Spent nearly a decade in Alabama as a philosophy professor and director of the honors program at Auburn University at Montgomery. In 2018, became the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel Dean and Chair of the Humanities at Cuyahoga Community College. Along with his wife and their 7 children, Matt came back to Hudson and is now raising his family in the same house in which he grew up. So he's kind of taken a page from Phil Herman from last week. Matt is currently the president-elect of the Mid-East Honors Association and is a member of the Hudson Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Alliance, and an active parishioner at St. Mary's Catholic Church. So take it away, Matt, and we're really looking forward to hear your comments this morning.
Well, thanks so much, John. I really appreciate it. I'm having weird technical problems, so I'm going to remove my earbuds. If anybody, oh, sorry, still having technical problems. Okay, that's better. So I will be able to hear you all. So if I like cut out or something, just start flailing your limbs, and I'll know that I need to put my earbuds back in. But good morning. Thank you so much for having me here. It really is an honor. As John mentioned, Hudson's my hometown, and I spent a lot of years dreaming of being able to come back home, and it's really, really cool to be here with you this morning, to be speaking to the Rotary Club of Hudson. So thanks for the opportunity, and I hope that what I have to offer today, I suspect will be different from a typical Rotary Club presentation, but I hope that you'll enjoy it. I hope you'll find it at least a little bit interesting. And if you don't, well, it's not that long. So civility, tribalism, and higher education. We find ourselves in the year 2020 in a deeply polarized society, a society where the very possibility of civil disagreement seems like it's in jeopardy. And it's kind of shocking when you think about it. I suspect that if somebody had told you in 1990 that 30 years in the future, serious people would be questioning the merits of free speech, or even if they told you back in 2006 that Facebook and Twitter would drive people apart instead of bringing us together, I suspect you would have been at least very surprised. As a young man in the early 2000s, preparing for a career as a philosophy professor and teaching courses on controversial moral issues, I would have been quite alarmed. And indeed, I am today very alarmed by the notion that's out there that some ideas shouldn't even be discussed, not even in a college classroom sometimes, because they're so offensive as to be traumatizing, or that words themselves can constitute, that is not merely precipitate or incite, but constitute violence. People on the political left believe that their Republican neighbors are a threat to the very existence of the country. And people on the right believe precisely the same thing about the Democrats next door to them. It's all a mess. And what I'd like to do this morning is offer a few very general thoughts on this mess, with a particular emphasis on the world of higher education. I do want to note at the outset that the broader story of polarization and tribalism in America is much, much broader than what I'll be discussing here. And it may well be the case that some of the things I won't discuss this morning actually play a more significant role overall than what I will discuss. So to give just a couple of examples, I'll mention that the 24-hour news cycle and our political primary system, and especially in my view, the ubiquity of social media, have played a huge role in polarizing the country. But I'm not going to say anything about those things. My academic training is in philosophy, and my career has been spent in colleges and universities. So those are the things that I'm going to talk about today. And one word of warning as we kind of dive in here, I usually don't recommend people doing philosophy this early in the day. So if you have the opportunity to refill your coffee before I really get into this stuff, I strongly encourage you to do so. In fact, I feel compelled to mention actually that this talk really became more philosophical than I'd expected when I initially sat down to start working on it. So, well, brace yourselves. And frankly, if at any point you find yourself thinking, what on earth is this guy talking about? Well, look, Marilyn and John are the ones who invited a guy with a PhD in philosophy to speak to the Rotary Club. So it's really their fault and not mine. All right, with all of that out of the way, let's think about some stuff. There's a set of ideas out there that are often referred to collectively as critical theory. And I'm going to argue that these ideas are part of the explanation of why American society is as polarized as it is. I'm also going to argue that the critical theory mindset itself is pretty deeply flawed. So what is it? What is this critical theory thing? Well, if you're at all familiar with the work of Karl Marx or Sigmund Freud, then you have at least some familiarity with two of the seminal thinkers in the critical theory tradition. This tradition has become massively influential in the academy, particularly in humanities and social sciences, which is the area where I've always worked. And at the risk of painting with too broad a brush, the core idea at the heart of critical theory is that ideologies of any kind are always expressions of subconscious, non-rational desires, frequently having to do with maintaining existing power relationships. So the Marxist, for example, says, you know, you can talk all you want, and I'm assuming that people have at least some broad familiarity with what I mean by Marxism and communism and ideas like that, and this is just an example, but the Marxist is going to say, yeah, talk all you want about natural rights to property, and you can use the language of free and voluntary exchange and all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, a property owner arguing in defense of capitalism is really just trying to make sure that he gets to remain in a position of power. And that's the case even if the capitalist doesn't realize that that's what he's doing. If you want a fancy 50-cent term for this core idea of critical theory, you can refer to it as the hermeneutics of suspicion. Hermeneutics is a technical term for the practice of interpreting a text. So when critical theorists encourage us to undertake a hermeneutic of suspicion, they're encouraging us to read between the lines, to figure out what's really going on behind the scenes. And this, I want to say, can be an incredibly useful and healthy approach. I'd say that that's especially true when we apply this tool on ourselves. So for me, as somebody who has studied and taught philosophy for a number of years, I found this mindset very, very helpful in trying to think through my beliefs about religious questions or debates about racism and sexism, to touch on some of the big controversies of the day. Right? In my own case, I'm a Christian. I'm a white guy. Well, I'm white and I'm a guy, right? I'm white and I'm male. Right? And as somebody who claims to be committed to pursuing truth and seeking justice, I want to be really careful. If I'm making an argument, for instance, if I'm making an argument for the existence of God, well, I want to be careful that it's actually a good argument, not merely something that appeals to me because I already happen to agree with its conclusion. And to touch on racism and sexism, if I find myself reacting strongly, or if I find myself like immediately skeptical when somebody makes a claim about white privilege, or when they assert the existence of persistent sexism in America, I want to look really carefully at my own subconscious motives and desires and think through, well, how might those affect my perspective, right? To what degree are my own desires and interests shaping the way I perceive other people's words, and even shaping the words that I say myself? Right? Am I really being honest? And critical theory, at its best, encourages all of us to engage in that sort of self-assessment. And in that respect, I want to say that critical theory is something that all of us should endorse. With that said, however, I don't think that critical theory should be accepted as an overarching ideology. And I want to argue that this idea, this whole kind of family of ideas that I'm calling the critical theory mindset, is flawed in at least 3 significant ways. First, it's self-undermining. Second, it makes appeals to justice incoherent. And third, it contributes to the contemporary climate of polarization, tribalism, and division. And so the bulk of what I want to do this morning is unpack these three claims. And this is what I meant when I said that this presentation got more philosophical than I had expected. I didn't intend to go as deep as I will into some of these issues, but what I want to spend the bulk of my time on is these 3 points right here, and then I'll conclude with some more kind of optimistic observations about some things that are out there. So the first problem, critical theory is self-undermining. Think again about the hermeneutics of suspicion and what that looks like in practice. We don't need to wrestle with the arguments for capitalism, the critical theorist tells us. Those arguments are merely tools used by the powerful, used by the bourgeoisie to oppress the proletariat, to oppress the working class, right? They're not arguments that we need to engage with. Rather, what we need to do is interrupt that whole system. We need to, instead of doing a philosophical debates or engaging at the level of ideas, revolution is the answer. Likewise, arguments for belief in God or Christianity can often be dismissed as mere sophistry, whose aim is to maintain a sexist status quo or something along those lines. The problem for the critical theorist is that we can dismiss the arguments for critical theory in precisely the same way. If we're permitted to reject arguments for capitalism on the grounds that those who try to defend it will benefit if they can persuade everyone else to agree with them, well, then it seems like we can reject any idea on the very same grounds. Communism, atheism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Given the premise of critical theory itself, the idea that ideologies are always expressions of subconscious desires for power and other things, given that premise, why should I accept any argument made by the critical theorist herself? Why is she exempt from the charge that her perspective is merely an expression of subconscious, non-rational desires? As the old saying has it, what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. If Jones over here, if Jones's views are undermined by the fact that Jones has a vested interest in them being true, then Smith's alternative views are undermined by the fact that Smith has a vested interest in them being true. But I want to say that's just silly. As C.S. Lewis points out in a terrific little essay called Bulverism, and the image here on the screen is from a really nice YouTube presentation of that video. I recommend it to you highly. If you search for C.S. Lewis, Bulverism, B-U-L-V-E-R-I-S-M, you'll find a YouTube video that's really worth watching. And as Lewis points out in his essay, ultimately, the only, oh, sorry, I lost where I was here. As Lewis points out in Bulverism, look, I have a vested interest in my belief that there's a positive balance in my checking account, right? If that's true, that's good news for me. But the fact that that's good news for me doesn't help me figure out whether or not I do have a positive balance in my checking account. The way I figure that out is not by looking at what's in my interest. The way I figure that out is by doing the math, right? By actually adding up what I have spent and subtracting that from how much I've made, right? And likewise, if I want to know whether I should agree with Jones or agree with Smith, then at the end of the day, all I can do is assess the reasons that are given on behalf of each of their positions. Are their claims true? Or at least are they well supported? Are they making valid inferences? And so on. All of that other stuff, their financial situation, their opportunities to gain or lose power, their wishes and desires, all of that is of secondary concern at most. As an overarching ideology, the critical theory mindset leads to a radical, universal skepticism that undermines critical theory itself. And that is the first problem. The second problem is that critical theory makes appeals to justice incoherent. And this leads to a phenomenon that strikes me as being, well, really, really weird. It's typical to find that college professors who work in the humanities and social sciences and who are steeped in the critical theory mindset are also frequently passionate about various issues that fall under the heading of social justice. Now, I don't want to get into any of the details of those debates this morning. I just want to observe that it's extremely difficult to see how someone can embrace the hermeneutics of suspicion on the one hand, and insist on the overriding need for a more just and equitable society on the other. Here's what I mean by that. Any case for social justice is going to be built on the assumption that there are standards of right and wrong, standards of justice and injustice, which are not merely conventional, right? Rather, they're standards that all of us are subject to. So what made the civil rights movement so compelling a generation ago, and what makes the Black Lives Matter movement so compelling for so many people today, is their recognition that injustice must be opposed, that it is wrong for those who are in power to exploit and oppress those who are not. But critical theory rests on the assumption that there are no standards of justice beyond whatever's in my interest or your interest, beyond whatever we decide we like best, right? Nobody's right or wrong when they make moral claims like there's a natural right to private property or all men are created equal, right? Those aren't things that are true or false. Those are just power plays. Those are just attempts to preserve power of various kinds. That is the whole point of the hermeneutics of suspicion stuff. But if that's the correct way to think about such things, then it's also the correct way to think about statements that my progressive friends want to make, right? A statement like, it is right to seek the liberation of the oppressed, or those who are in positions of privilege and power have an obligation to aid those who are not, right? If those statements are true, then we seem to be appealing to something beyond merely who has the power and who doesn't, but rather a deeper, more fundamental, transcendent standard of justice. To put the point another way, consider this question. If I find myself in a privileged, powerful group, why would I ever have reason to support a movement that might threaten my privilege or power? Why shouldn't I do whatever I possibly can to ensure that I retain and increase my advantages? Now, it seems to me, stepping away from critical theory stuff, it seems to me that there's a pretty easy and obvious answer to that question. The answer is because preserving your power might involve doing something immoral or something unjust, right? And that's an overriding reason not to do it. But at the risk of belaboring the point, I don't see how the critical theorist can possibly say such a thing, at least not with a straight face, right? If the fundamental story about ideologies, about different perspectives on the world, if the deepest, most fundamental story we can tell is about struggles for power, then there's no such thing as justice with a capital J. There's just whatever advances my interests and whatever advances yours. And in that case, there's no grounds for me to critique you or you to critique me. All we can do is battle with each other to try to secure power. But that's crazy, isn't it? All of our normal moral discourse is built on the opposite foundation, on the assumption that there can be, and often are, rational grounds for critiquing social structures. Power can be used well, we all recognize this, and it can be used badly. Some societies are more just than others, and all of us have an obligation to pursue justice within our own spheres of influence, whether doing so is immediately useful to us or not. If that's true, though, then the critical theory mindset is fundamentally wrong. That's the second problem, and it leads to the third, namely, the critical theory mindset promotes a culture of distrust. It's right there in the name, right? The hermeneutics of suspicion. Don't trust, don't take others' words at face value. Assume that other people, at least the ones who disagree with you, are always seeking to obtain power over others and to maximize that power, so on and so forth, right? Be suspicious. You never trust what somebody is saying to be what they're really about. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that adherents of critical theory explicitly or even consciously teach their students to act this way. Many of them aren't consciously operating these terms in their everyday interactions. Many of them, frankly, are better than their philosophy is, in my humble opinion. But what I am saying is that an intellectual climate in which the hermeneutics of suspicion takes hold is a climate ripe for polarization and tribalism. And that is the intellectual climate of much of the humanities and social sciences in America today. And as healthy as it is to turn the lens of suspicion on ourselves, right? As healthy and profitable as it is for seekers of truth and justice to look in the mirror and say, am I really being honest, right? Am I sincere? Or am I really just trying to massage these ideas so that I get what I want, right? That's good, that's healthy. But it's downright poisonous when that same lens gets turned outward and when that becomes our default setting for dealing with other people. In addition, because of its focus on social structures and power dynamics, the critical theory mindset looks primarily or even exclusively at the groups to which individuals belong, instead of looking at the individuals themselves, frequently obsessing over the amount of power any particular group has relative to the others. And this makes it all but inevitable that we wind up thinking in terms of us versus them, convinced that all the good people are over here with us, and all the bad people are over there with them. And again, when that happens, you're at war. There's no point in promoting discussion and dialogue because the bad guys are so bad and so wrong that it's futile. All we can do at that point is try to stop them. A culture of tribalism, hostility, and division, in other words, is exactly what you'd expect from a culture where the critical theory mindset has taken root. And insofar as American colleges and universities have contributed to our polarized climate, it's largely due to the influence of that mindset. So that's the main thing I want to communicate today. Like I said, it was a bit of relatively serious philosophizing and maybe a little bit of pontificating as well. But it's the main thing I want to share. It's also the bleakest thing that I want to share. It's not the only thing that I want to share though. And before closing, I do want to note a positive sign or two and offer a little bit of advice on how we can promote civility and productive dialogue in our own spheres of influence. So first, in terms of positive trends, it's been really good to see, and even just within the last couple of months, there seems to be more of a groundswell in this direction. It's been very good to see an increasing number of scholars, university professors, and others defending the traditional viewpoint that free speech is crucial to the academy and to a healthy republic, and the idea that ideas must be assessed on their own merits. So if you follow any of these things in the news, you may have seen some of these recently. But just last month, Harper's Magazine published a letter on justice and open debate, signed by well over 100 authors and scholars. In a similar vein, and also this summer, Johns Hopkins University political scientist Yascha Mounk launched the Persuasion think tank and online community, immediately attracting thousands of paid subscribers. The New York Times, which is sometimes dismissed by people on the right as a liberal bastion, produces a podcast called The Argument, which features conservative and liberal editorial writers discussing the issues of the day together, and which is evidence of a public appetite for thoughtful engagement on contentious issues. There are organizations like like Freedom for Individual Rights in Higher Education, FIRE. Here in Northeast Ohio, the City Club of Cleveland remains a beacon of free speech a century after its founding. And right here in Summit County, the University of Akron recently established a civility center to foster productive dialogue on challenging issues. All of these are positive and encouraging signs. And finally, what can those of us who care about civil discourse actually do to hopefully help this trend along? I'll suggest three main things. Maybe the biggest in terms of having an outsized impact is looking for opportunities to explicitly support civility, free speech, and open dialogue and take action. And thinking specifically of the world of higher education, for example, if you're a college graduate, it would not be an unreasonable or a hopeless task to work with your alumni network, to encourage your alma mater to embrace the University of Chicago's Statement on Principles of Free Expression, or something similar to it. That's a document that's widely hailed as the gold standard for free speech codes in higher education. And if I may submit, I think our public discourse would be healthier if every college in the country embraced the ethos of that Chicago statement. Second, maybe most obvious, practice what you preach. And there's some very Rotarian themes here. Be civil yourself. Seek to become someone who genuinely listens to people on both sides of an issue. Go to events at the City Club and the University of Akron Civility Center. Participate in reading groups like the Hudson Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Alliance's upcoming White Fragility Dialogues. Assume that the people you disagree with are motivated by good intentions, and be open to the possibility that they have real wisdom to offer. Don't criticize an idea until you're confident you understand it. If you cannot explain a view in terms that its supporters would endorse, then you're probably not in a position to assess it fairly. And look for good books to read. A couple of my favorites are here on the screen, focusing specifically on these kinds of topics. One is called How to Think by Alan Jacobs. And the other is a fairly new book called The Coddling of the American Mind by Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt. And finally, the last thing that I want to say is to remember that real life isn't Twitter, and not everything is political. Let me encourage everybody, both for yourselves and to encourage others to do the same, to seek and cultivate opportunities to engage with others in contexts where there's no need to talk about contentious issues. Much of the incivility in the world today stems from separating people into us and them instead of focusing on our shared human identity. And spending time getting to know people and partnering with them in shared interests is recognized very widely as the best tool we've got for turning them into us. So thank you so much for having me here this morning, and for the opportunity to share some thoughts on these issues. If anybody has any questions, I will be happy to try to answer them.
Again, if you have a question, please unmute yourself, and then once you finish your question, please remute yourself. And please don't have follow-up questions, so that way we can get to everyone.
I have a question.
Hi, yeah, hi, Joseph.
Hi, Matt. Thanks for a great presentation. I really appreciate it. Yeah, so I'm a little background. I'm an Anglican priest, so I share a lot of your sensibilities, and are really thrilled with your approach. I thought for sure you were going to a hermeneutic of charity, maybe good to get there. I guess my question is rather a big, encompassing philosophical one, which is, it seems to me that one of the real root problems of humanity is tribalism, that we are instinctively tribal, that, you know, what critical theory does is exploit the tribalism that already exists. And if you think back to the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King Jr., one of the reasons that he was able to accomplish so much is that he appealed to the sense that all Americans are part of one tribe, and that there was this failure to live up to the basic tenets of the tribal identity. A letter from a Birmingham jail, and then of course the I Have a Dream speech. How do we, I guess, expose the tribalism that is so much a part of our human identity, so that we can, you know, at least begin to address that on a broader scale?
It's a great question. And and it's a practical one, right? About how do we actually make that happen? I think the main thing that any of us can do is, I don't want to say unfortunately here because it's not unfortunate per se, but the main thing we can do is work with actual people that we know, right? When we can bring people together from across different kinds of divides, and they actually encounter each other as human beings, I think that does more good than anything else we can. This is, as a dean of humanities and as a professor of philosophy, this has been for a long time one of my main arguments for the importance of humanities education, because the college classroom is one of the last places in America where people who have fundamentally different views of the world actually get together and talk to each other. And it's part of why I asked John to mention in my bio that I'm a part of that Hudson Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Alliance. And I'd actually spoken to Phil earlier in the summer about that group, and he was the one who connected me with them to try to promote conversations on issues like race that hopefully we can bring people together who don't already have the same view and talk. And even if we don't end up agreeing with each other on all the details of a particular controversy or another, what hopefully can happen is that we do begin to see each other as humans. And Joseph, have you read The Coddling of the American Mind? It's interesting because the point you made is really simpatico with some of what they say there. They make the case in the book that we shouldn't dismiss identity product. Excuse me. Sorry, I have the thing where I'm hearing myself in my ears. That's why I'm kind of. Okay, here's what they say in the book. A lot of us are very skeptical of identity politics, and with some good reason. And they say, don't be so hasty. They argue that there's nothing but identity politics. So when farmers get together to lobby Congress, that's a kind of identity politics, right? They're coming together as farmers, and it's the case for any other sort of political advocacy. But they said there's a difference between common enemy identity politics, where we say, our people are over here and we're fighting the evil people over there, versus a common humanity identity politics. And like you did, Joseph, they point to Dr. King and other great leaders of the civil rights movement whose whole ethos was grounded in this idea that human beings are fundamentally equal, right? And that what unites us is more foundational and more significant than what divides us. So I don't know if that was actually an answer to your question, but it was long.
I have a second question on that is kind of related. There are a number of us at this meeting who live at Laurel Lake, and this organization has a culture where you're not supposed to engage in discourse about politics or religion, that it's socially unacceptable. And so some of us would like to break that culture. Do you have some suggestions for how to do that, other than we do have some underground discussions, and there are some people like Den and Mary and others and myself who tend to instigate, but it is a culture, and sometimes you'll be told, directly, well, that's a political question, or that's a religious question. We can't discuss that. And it's,
yeah. I mean, that's tricky, right? And at some point, if somebody simply does not want to engage on a topic, there's not much we can do.
No, there isn't.
I think in terms of shifting an institutional culture, if you can invite people to conversations where in good faith you demonstrate an interest in hearing from both sides. So like maybe you find a YouTube video with somebody giving a short talk on the conservative side of an issue and on the liberal side. And you just say, hey, let's get some people together and have a conversation about their presentations. This is something I've been trying to do at Tri-C, actually. I lead a Dean's reading group regularly. And actually, that was how I ended up, I've got the Coddling the American Mind right here. We did a reading group. We had about 30 professors and administrators this summer who read this and wrestled with it. It was really good because it created a context where we were talking about an argument that these authors were making instead of like, well, I think this, and I know you disagree, so let me show you that you're wrong. Instead, it was like, oh, I thought this was interesting, and what do you think about this idea here? And especially if you have a plan for that kind of engagement where you are bringing both sides in. And again, I'm doing it this fall at the college where we're reading a
What's happening? We're frozen. All the sound just went.
It appears that he is frozen.
Yeah, I think it might be an issue with his.
I was afraid I was the only one not frozen.
Yeah. Okay.
Hi, I'm back.
He's back.
So it's a good thing I was in the meeting twice because now here I am again.
Yes. There's one conundrum that I think all face right now related to the ability to engage in discourse, and that is that here we cannot engage in groups of more than 10 people. We used to be able to do that, but right now, because of COVID, it's one of the strategies for trying to prevent the spread. So doing this virtually is a bigger challenge, and I think that our society is going to be confronted with the reality of trying to do things virtually that we used to do face to face, and I think that's a bigger challenge.
I think you're absolutely right. There can be something to be said, though, for being stuck with a smaller group, because usually in terms of getting conversation going and getting people to open up and be honest, having a smaller group is usually a more effective way to do it.
Matt, are you familiar with this booklet? I'm sure you are. It is George Washington's Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior. 250 years ago, he was most concerned about things that you actually covered today. And it's really hilarious to read it. And there's one in here that I particularly enjoy. It says, sleep not when others speak. Sit not when others stand. Speak not when you should hold your peace. Walk not on when others stop. And there are literally 100 of those.
That is phenomenal. I have not seen that, but I will absolutely pick up a copy. That sounds great. Thanks for the recommendation.
Hey, Matt, thank you for being here. It was awesome. Heard you speak before, and you do a great job. Hey, I've in looking at your presentation and probably even an expansion of it, I would think that political strategists today would learn from you, but not take the advice from you. They would use it to how to manipulate and produce tribalism. A better understanding of how it occurs, and therefore they can use it as a strategy to meet their ends.
Mm-hmm.
So if you were in a meeting and this was a bunch of political strategists, what would you say?
I would say I'm really glad that I'm not a politician. I mean, it's tough because you're right. Appealing to tribal instincts can be a way of getting people to the polls. I'm not, going to comment one way or the other on the current presidential race in terms of, how people should vote or whatever. But I think that you can look at the Trump campaign as at least part of their strategy, purely in practical terms, is to push people to think in these kinds of categories, a very us and them kind of mindset. And I guess what I would say, if I don't know why somebody would bring me in as a political consultant, because this is not the kind of advice you want from a political consultant. But I would ask the question, who do we want to be as a country, right? And what compromises are we willing to make in order to acquire power? Because it may well be that you have to choose. Now, I'm kind of inclined to think, just the way people talk, many people are really troubled by polarization and tribalism and division and all this stuff. And the problem is, those of us who are in that camp, for some of the same reasons that we're in that camp, we don't tend to be as noisy as the people who are highly tribal on the extremes, right? I think, to put on my totally amateur political observer hats, if Joe Biden wins the election this fall, I suspect it will be because that aspect of his demeanor, in contrast to Donald Trump's approach of emphasizing divisions, is going to, win the hearts and minds, as they say. So I guess, as a moral philosopher, I would want my answer to your question would be, I think we need to think about what kinds of people we want to become. As a political prognosticator, I would say, I think that there's a good bet to be made that somebody who really appeals to unity and bridging divides and so on could win a lot of votes in this country. But I don't know.
My simple question is, regarding the divides of suspicion, just putting out a sign in your yard. I've heard people say, oh, we're afraid to put something out, we're just going to go and vote. And
Yep.
I thought to myself, I mean, have some courage. Give me your opinion here.
I think it's really hard. Like, I was thinking about whether I would want to put a yard sign out this fall, and I decided I don't want to, because in my case, I have friends who are both on the conservative side and friends who are on the liberal side. And I know that both groups are going to assume a lot more about me on the basis that, because of where we are as a culture, right? And so there's not a lot of room for nuance, and it's tough. And that's not to say that I don't think anybody should put out a yard sign. I was thinking of the reaction that my own friend group would have if I did, and I decided that for me personally, it's not worth the cost. But I don't know, that honestly, that might be cowardice. I don't want to assume that just because it's the decision I made that it's the right one.
Doctor, this is Phil Tobin here. What can we learn from the Irish experience? I happen to be Irish, and knowing a little bit about history, what can we learn about how early prejudices of the Irish in the earlier days of this country have disappeared? And fundamentally, even the idea of modern Irish people, from English viewpoint, where the Northern Irelands were considered one tribe versus the Irish Republic, when they come to this country, you don't recognize a person as being from Northern Ireland or from the Irish Republic. So that tribalism sort of disappears. Well, what is there about that experience of the Irish that we can translate into what's considered by many as the problems that the Black community are experiencing right now in terms of social injustice and tribalism?
That's an excellent question. I should note that it is beyond my expertise, so I'll take a quick stab at it, but I need to qualify any opinion I give as saying it's, I'm a rank amateur when it comes to that kind of issue. I think on the one hand, the Irish are a paradigm case of a group that suffered significant discrimination and were victims of real prejudice, who were then successfully integrated or assimilated into American society. I think the situation for Black Americans is similar, but the degree of the injustice and the prejudice and discrimination is much, much greater. And I think it has less to do with questions of skin color than to do with the actual historical legacy of slavery itself, and then the failed era of Reconstruction and Jim Crow, and the way tough on crime laws have worked, and all kinds of social issues that have created this wealth gap, and schools that tend to be majority students of color also tend to perform less well than schools that are majority white, right? All of these different dynamics. So the question was, what can we learn from that? And I think that the short answer is that if we can successfully create a social system where people really do have social mobility, where it's possible to rise above one's station, as they used to say, then I think that we have hope for a model that can work. But I'm reluctant to say anything more concrete or specific than that, because I'm not an expert on public policy, and for that matter, not an expert on race issues either, just somebody who's trying to understand those a little bit better myself. Does that help? Is that even remotely an answer to your question?
I'll jump in with a question. It's interesting, and I think well, you seem to have frozen here, but hopefully everyone can hear what I'm saying. It was interesting on Facebook, you have your Facebook groups talk about tribalism, and there's the Hudson Roundtable. And originally they had a discussion of various issues like phase 2 and having the expansion of the internet and that sort of thing. And I was looking forward to it as a way to see the arguments pro and con, and kind of a straight discussion of it. But the discussion seemed to devolve very quickly into accusations that one side or the other was supporting something nefariously, and sort of personal attacks, and actually is extended. And I sort of despaired for the idea that I was actually going to hear the pros and cons of these issues. And I guess the question is that sort of relating to what you're saying in terms of how the discussion veers off, into this sort of tribalism, and then obviously the question of how do we veer it back?
Yeah. So the easy part of that is, yes, absolutely, it's connected. Social media has been a catastrophe for us, and it's really, I made a passing comment about it at the very beginning of the talk, but in 2006, I think all of us were very optimistic that oh, this is great. Like I can see people I haven't seen in 10 years, and find out who's married and who's got kids, and this is going to connect us, and internet's going to make us smarter because there's so information so easy to get to. And it's just the opposite, right? We're way more divided than we were, and we have too much information out there, and it's too difficult for most people to figure out what's the quality stuff and what isn't. It's a debacle. The harder question is, how do we recover that? And I don't know. I don't know if there's a viable, other than those small individual choices. I alluded to this earlier with a question that I think Joseph was asking, when I said, look, if we can get little groups of people together, if we can get them in a classroom talking about difficult issues, or if we can get them in a reading group, or bring them together, that's small scale stuff. But if we can do that at a broad enough scale, I think that might have a real impact. And I think there's something similar here, where we're not going to have, we're not going to forbid social media. We're not going to make it illegal. We're not going to be able to forbid people from ever getting on Facebook. But I think that the more we can ourselves make choices that minimize the role of social media in our lives, if nothing else, we'll be happier people. I'll give you another book recommendation on this front. There's a book called Digital Minimalism that's my whole family just read, or not the whole family, but those of us who are over 14 all read Digital Minimalism. And it's excellent. And it really challenged me to think about the use of technology in my life. I've since deleted Facebook and Twitter from my phone. I haven't been on Facebook in weeks now. And, you know, I don't know that that's making the world a better place, but it's making my life a happier one.
Matt, this is Marilyn Orr. I have a quick question about the future of liberal arts education. It seems that many of our students are going in and focusing on a very narrow area of development, like technology skills or science or engineering, and it seems that there's very little time in that course to get through college to focus on the broader issue of liberal arts. Can you address that briefly as to what you're doing at Cuyahoga Community College about that?
Briefly is the word that made me smile there. So in terms of what we're doing and what I'm doing in particular at Tri-C, that I can answer briefly. We are very fortunate to have the backing of the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel Foundation, who are very heavily invested in Cleveland. You see that name everywhere. And they're also very invested in humanities education. And so they gave Tri-C the largest gift in the college's history about 5 years ago. It was $10 million to create the center that I'm the dean of. And explicit in their vision, and part of what that gift was given to do was to create an academic program that would bring in 100 students every year with a full tuition scholarship and money for books, and have them complete a humanities-based curriculum that would also cultivate their leadership skills and get them thinking about Northeast Ohio. So in terms of engaging, in terms of what we're doing at Tri-C, that's one very specific one where we're very fortunate to have a program that has humanities in its DNA. At the broader level with higher ed, you're exactly right. The liberal arts have been under attack for quite a while. And the quick answer from my perspective is that we're faced with this very difficult self-fulfilling prophecy where most people have bought into the following mindset. They've said, A, what college is about is getting a job, and B, the only thing that's useful for getting a job is specific technical skills or learning business or something like that. And the reality is, and there's all kinds of ways of demonstrating this, but a humanities-driven liberal arts education really does cultivate what we call transferable skills, right? Strong communication skills, critical thinking, the ability to analyze a problem, the ability to be more empathetic, like all kinds of things that are extraordinarily useful regardless of what particular job somebody happens to get. And I think what we need to do within higher ed is we've got to find a way to have our cake and eat it too. We both need to make the case that humanities education is strongly connected to producing better employees. And then we need to find ways to integrate humanities stuff into a more professional oriented curriculum. And very, very quickly, one way that might get translated in the future is a stronger emphasis on humanities and liberal arts in the first 2 years of the curriculum, and probably fewer and fewer humanities majors per se, but with more humanities stuff integrated into professional disciplines in the last 2 years. But I'm starting to talk fast because I see that it's 8:28 and I know we need to wrap up very, very quickly.
We started just a bit late, so we're fine on time. We're fine on time. Now, I think it's absolutely amazing that we had this talk this week, as we had the Democratic convention last week and the Republican convention happening this week. We couldn't be more timely with this topic. And thank you, Matt. You've nailed a number of things, and honestly, it's early in the morning to be thinking this seriously, but this is wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. Next week.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for having me. It really is an honor to speak with you this morning.
This is terrific. I love it. I absolutely love it. So anyway, this was a bit of a challenge for us, but at the same time, a very new perspective, and it was very, very special. Thank you. So next week, we actually will start a month of focus on Rotary itself. Next week's speaker is Jim Lechko, the Rotary Foundation Chair for District 6630, and we'll be learning about all of the good works that is done by the Rotary Foundation in the United States as well as throughout the world. And I'm going to close today by talking about this day in history. In 1346, cannons were used for the very first time at the Battle of Crécy in northern France. The victor was Edward III of England, and the course of history was changed. In 1498, Michelangelo received the commission to create the Pietà. He was 23 years old. Both the Pietà and the David were completed before he reached the age of 30. And in 1843, Charles Thurber invents and patents a new machine that we now know as the typewriter. It was slow, it was clunky, and it actually never made it into production. But it was the first idea in which there was a theme between letters and your fingers and pushing a button in order to communicate. And it was originally designed to be a way for communication for the blind and to make legal documents legible. Okay, so with that, we're wishing you a good week, and we'll see you next week. Thank you, and I hope you have a great day.